the government developed this program specifically for reservations and people who live near them, and they just send out boxes of food. The problem with the boxes is they're filled with undesirable food. So they're mostly surplus commodities that have become surplus because of subsidies by the government. So it's like canned food and that sugar, the white flour, the oil. A lot of the time, the produce is just rotted and, nobody would want to eat it.
Welcome to the show this week, y'all. Really happy to be here. Alexandra and I are together, which is happening less often. So we're really happy about that. And we have an extraordinary guest. I am very excited to, it's like a treat. It's like a treat for you all. So I am going to just read her intro because I can't memorize it because it's so long and illustrious. So hang with me as you learn a bit more about Andrea Freeman. Access to healthy food is something many people take for granted. Yet throughout history, food has frequently been used as a tool for control and coercion. Today, similar strategies persist, affecting marginalized communities across the United States with the very systems designed to feed our nation. In some cases, perpetuating inequality and injustice, making access to nutritious food a privilege rather than a right. So we're excited to welcome a leading expert on food politics, Andrea Freeman, a professor at Southwestern Law, where she teaches courses including constitutional law and food law and policy. Her groundbreaking book, Skimmed: Breastfeeding, Race, and Injustice, tells the story of the Fultz quadruplets, exploited for commercial gain by a baby food company, with a critical examination of racial inequities that helped launch a multi-billion-dollar industry. And her latest book, Ruining Their Crops on the Ground: The Politics of Food in the United States, From the Trail of Tears to School Lunch, explores the deep-rooted and ongoing impacts of food politics, tracing the systemic issues that influence access to healthy food, from historical injustices all the way to our modern challenges. Professor Freeman's work has been highlighted in leading publications such as the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and NPR, where I found her. She has also served on the ACLU Hawaii Litigation Committee and is founding member of the Academy of Food, Law, and Policy. So stay with us as we explore her pioneering advocacy and discuss these critical issues at the crossroads of law, race, and food justice. Welcome to the show, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Oh, well, it was incredibly inspiring for me to hear about your book and your interview with Aisha on NPR after our marketing director here at Switch, Tony Sloan, sent me the link. And after just 6 minutes, because I think that was the snippet of the link that he sent me, I knew that we had to meet. Switch for Good, as an organization and a podcast, we're no strangers to food justice, food injustice. And we have a bill in Congress right now with 51 House co-sponsors and 4 Senate leaders that, just to put it very simply, ends the 70-year-old cow's milk mandate and allows for a plant-based alternative to be served. And you and our audience know all of the deleterious effects, especially on BIPOC communities, of being force-fed cow's milk. So I want to start out because I'm first interested in your thoughts on the treatment of BIPOC populations regarding food access or lack thereof and its intersection with nutrition. And I'm wondering if you think that this is a result of just intentional neglect, or are systemic issues being overlooked and allowed to persist?
Great. Well, you started off with just a really softball, right? No.
I know it's a little loaded. That really could be like 3 questions, couldn't it?
Well, as I detail in my new book, there is a long history of the United States using food as a tool of oppression and subordination, as part of racial capitalism, as part of colonization and enslavement, and then attempts to Americanize immigrants. And so that part of history had that very intentional, racist, tone. I mean, that's what it was, right? I mean, that was outwardly the motivation. When you talk about food oppression in the present, it is more baked into the system from that history. And I think instead of describing it as something intentional, we can think of it as something more like deliberate indifference or neglect, or, you know, the knowledge is there that when we have policies that disadvantage Indigenous, Black, Latina, and other populations of color, everybody knows. But because it's not obvious, it's not people saying blatantly racist things most of the time, then it can be excused as just an unintended consequence.
So can we get a more specific, because your book, Ruin Your Crops on the Ground, explores the long history of the US government and how it's used these food policies to oppress people. Let's start with George Washington at the beginning of the encroachment of, the United States of America. Share with us how he used food policy to oppress other peoples, and later on American slaves after his reign.
So the title of the book, Ruin Their Crops on the Ground, comes from an order that George Washington gave regarding strategies to get Indigenous people off the land so that settlers could take it and keep it. And throughout that beginning history, when the goal was to basically exterminate the Indigenous population and then to move and then to assimilate, the idea was that the United States, if they took away Indigenous food, then they could starve people, or they could later then force them to become white in a way. So we see the introduction of white foods in the federal Indian boarding schools, where first the government used the threat of withdrawing rations or any food at all from families to force them to send their kids to the schools. And then when the kids were in the schools, they were fed these very unfamiliar foods that often made them sick in an attempt to whiten them, to famously kill the Indian and save the man, as the founder of the boarding school said. So that was a common strategy throughout colonization, and we're still seeing effects of that. And I know you want to talk about the present later, so we can leave that for now. And then food played a major role in enslaving people as well. So enslavers had very carefully calculated how much food to give so that people could still work and have enough energy for that, but not enough to revolt. I mean, no, that was their plan anyway. And then they built an entire food system around trying to keep people enslaved and keep them from having food that they could sell or food that they could enjoy. Right. Food just played a role in all of that.
I first learned about these injustices as it relates to food insecurity, and like literally changing the culture of the Indigenous food in Manitoba, Canada. I didn't really know the history very well, but they have a very similar history to the United States in that way. And I completely understand how this took place in our public school system, right? Feeding them white food, it's making them sick and taking away their Indigenous food. But how did they take away their Indigenous food from them in their own homes? They weren't allowed to grow it anymore. I mean, how did they control that? How did the white people control that?
So basically what happened is people were moved away from their homes. So Indigenous people lived on land that they cultivated in their own ways, and they had different ways of moving around to accommodate the food, the seasonal foods, and the seasonal migration animals and things like that, right? But then they were forced into what was called Indian Territory, right? And that's where you have the Trail of Tears, which also involved starving people to get them to move to where the government wanted them to be. And in that new land, there was not the same kind of soil, there weren't the same kind of animals, there wasn't the same kind of food available, right? So there's an adaptation there. But then the US also tried to force indigenous farmers to take on the Western agricultural practices. So, giving land contingent on receiving training and growing certain crops and that kind of thing, right? But really what happened is with the moving dislocation, displacement, destruction of everything about indigenous lifestyles, they became dependent on rations from the US government. And it was those rations that made up the greater part of the diet, unless people were lucky enough to live in a place that did have a lot of, great crops, which some people did, but for the most part, not. We also had, active murder of bison so that they couldn't be eaten and they're part of the culture, right? It's like the destruction of culture, the replacement of food with these rations, and the rations were just the worst of Western food. So that's how, because the food that people had at home wasn't the food that they would have chosen. It was the food that they had to take.
There's this myth about the first Thanksgiving where the native indigenous people shared their food with the European settlers, and we all were one happy family sharing food. And frankly, the truth is, I always thought that we did sort of eat the same way. Can you share with us the differences in the way that the European settlers ate and the way the indigenous people of this country ate?
I mean, so milk is one of the big differences that I know y'all know a lot about. And so, milking cows for milk, that was, that came from the English settlers, and they even wanted to bring their own cows over so that they could have that, because that was not anything that, in fact, that made indigenous people sick, right? And there was a lot of effort to try to force indigenous people to drink milk, especially to their babies, which made all babies at that time, like in the 1800s, sick, for various reasons, including not pasteurizing and that. But you get these quotes, and I have some of them in the book, where it's the scorn of indigenous people not feeding their children milk, when in fact, like, that was helping them survive, right? And then things like white flour, which was not what indigenous people ate. When they ate bread and other similar things, that it was made nutritiously from high nutritional content things ground into flour, not this white wheat flour, sugar, just they, for sweet things, they ate more fruits and things like that. So it was just a completely different diet. But when the English people came over to colonize, they got here and didn't know what to do, right? They didn't understand how to eat. And so they forced indigenous people to either give them their food or show them how to get the food, and then just took it.
You mentioned the Trail of Tears, which I definitely had to look up, and it was basically the forced displacement of, I read, approximately 60,000 people of the 5 civilized tribes in the mid 1800s. And I'm curious in what ways do historical injustices, which there are aplenty, but like the Trail of Tears, how do they continue to influence contemporary food policies today and access to healthy food? Is it seems like we still have a food system that is very set up the way that you're describing it was in the 1800s.
Right. So that idea of rations and the government being the main supplier of food to indigenous communities has continued into the present, now through the USDA's food distribution program for Indian reservations. So a lot of people who were forced into that land that became reservations and now live there live in poverty. In a great part because of this not having land that is fruitful or other good sources of income. And so we have this system SNAP, right, which is started as food stamps, and that's usually how the government gives people food, access to food who don't have it. But it relies on people being able to shop, and a lot of reservations don't have good stores. So instead, the government developed this program specifically for reservations and people who live near them, and they just send out boxes of food. The problem with the boxes is they're filled with undesirable food. So they're mostly surplus commodities that have become surplus because of subsidies by the government. So it's like canned food and that sugar, the white flour, the oil. A lot of the time, the produce is just rotted and, nobody would want to eat it. Yeah, there's a lot of stories about how bad the food is. Huge blocks of cheese, which again, a lot of people are lactose intolerant or have other issues with consuming dairy, but that's one of the main staples of the food that gets sent. So we still have rations in place, even though they're not called rations anymore. Now they're called commod boxes.
Commod bod is what some of the indigenous people call themselves, what they get from this crap that we're shipping them.
I think I read in your writings that the meat that they send is often so bad that people don't even eat that. So they end up eating the high carbohydrate, highly processed foods that give them what Dotsie was talking about, the commod bod, which is overweight with diabetes and maybe other health-related diseases you can discuss.
Yeah. I mean, anything, the more processed it is, the higher, the preservatives, because you think about just the journey that this food is making from, where it starts out on a farm somewhere, and then it has to be packaged and stored and sent and all of that, right? And so really only the highly processed, high preservative type of food ends up being something edible when it gets to people. So then that's the food that makes us sick.
And this is excess food, right? It's sort of food that the government's trying to get rid of. Why is it trying to why is it there in the first place to get rid of? And who benefits?
Yeah, so there's a long history to these commodities that start in the 1930s. And that was when the government first decided to subsidize some agricultural industries to prevent them from just going under. That was during the Depression. And so at that time, there were a lot of hungry people in the United States, and they selected crops that would be good to, fill people up. So things like soy and corn and wheat and milk and meat. And these industries grew because they were subsidized. And so farms really focused on trying to produce the things where they could get federal money. And then as they grew and consolidated, they gained more power within the US government and were able to keep those subsidies in place so that we still have the same subsidized foods today of almost 100 years ago, even though our nutritional needs have changed a lot, right? We're not worried as much about people going hungry in the United States as the fact that poor nutrition is the highest number, responsible for the highest number of preventable deaths, right? More than smoking, more than car accidents. That is literally what is killing people now. And so we have that change, and that change has been around for probably about 50 years now. but we didn't see a change in what gets subsidized by the government because of the corporate capture of those subsidies. So part of the deal of the subsidies is that the USDA will take any surplus and be responsible for it and try to get rid of it. But it's hard to do because by definition, surplus is food that people don't want. So they have to store it. And then they came up with the idea of giving it to people who wouldn't be able to buy it anyway, because then it doesn't affect the market for those goods. So there's a few programs. One is school lunches, which I'm sure we're also going to talk about. And then this food distribution program for Indian reservations is another outlet to dump unwanted food that nobody wants to buy, but it can be given for free.
We've talked a bit about the, governmental, influence and complete control in shaping food policy really from the beginning. I want to ask you about the history of corporate interests playing a significant role in shaping food policy, because I mean we see it alive and well every day, and I certainly see it when we go to Washington and lobby and have conversations with Congress. I mean, there's some that I mean, it's like, I'm like, does the dairy industry have a hit on their wife or something? It's so strong. And our bill is literally just to offer an alternative. There's nothing in it that takes milk out of schools. I mean, that would be an argument that we should think about that. But since it makes, 60, 70%, 80% of the BIPOC children sick, uncomfortable, and in some cases unable to breathe well for the last 78 years since we've had this milk mandate. But what is the history of corporate interest playing this role in shaping our food policy to where we've gotten to where we are today?
So really everything in history and all of the oppression that we've touched on a little already, right? Like, it's all economic, right? So why did settlers come here and take over? For economic gain. Why were people enslaving other people to produce, right? And a lot of the story of immigration is also about capitalism and workers and all of that. So sort of capitalism and corporations is just inextricably intertwined with the story of food and food justice and injustice in the United States, right? And it plays out in so many different ways. So we've talked about what foods people can eat when they don't have enough money to make enough choice, right? But there's also a whole other story about food marketing and the way that corporations have taken control of that and have essentially no restrictions on not just ensuring that their foods are the most available, and especially to young people, but also that they're the most advertised to young people.
You talk about how fast food companies, since you brought that up, have zeroed in on kids of color in their marketing. Can you explain why?
Yeah. So they are really appealing targets for the fast food industry. They eat more fast food than white kids generally. And, there's a whole story about that. But
you'd like to hear that story. Yeah. Because it's hard to know if it's I don't want to use a non-vegan, I won't say chicken or the egg. What came first? Kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, so there's a lot about access and supposed choice and where you live and what you can get where you live, right? So, and this is true for example, we talk about Indigenous populations and we talked about living on a reservation, but then we didn't talk about the movement to move Indigenous people into cities that happened in sort of, around the 50s, 60s, right? And then people had to move into areas where what we would now call a food swamp, right? Where there's there's food, but it's all junk food, right? So we used to use this term food desert, which is kind of problematic, right? We can think about the idea of food apartheid, where, there's good foods. I've got a Whole Foods near me I can go to. But if I lived in another part of LA, anything I could get to, especially if I didn't have a car, would be, the corner store, the liquor store, and many, many fast food outlets. Right. And so if you go to school and they give you junk food, and then you come home and the only thing you can get is junk food, and the family doesn't have time to cook, right? Or people are working and they might be working different jobs, or, you just have to eat what is there. And if the only thing there is cheap fast food, and it's only cheap because of subsidies, right? Or, really jacked up, like overpriced food from corner stores, like you don't have a grocery store, then that's what you're going to be eating. So it's not about taste or any kind of real choice. It's about what can you access with the time and money and resources that you have.
So that's more of an economic look at it. So that doesn't explain why the fast food companies though target people of color, because there's a lot of people
okay.
of color.
So first, I was answering the part about why are they
I appreciate that
in the first place. Yeah. Okay. They target them because, well, so that's the piece about they're eating more, right? They're also, often trendsetter, kind of like influencer, celebrity, and very vulnerable to marketing because of issues around developing identities, teenagers and developing their personal identities and their racial identities, and all of this at the same time just kind of gives an entrance. So there's a lot of money that's poured into targeting youth of color. Yeah. And of course, now it's extremely high tech, right? So it used to be, we'd be pulling out, talking about statistics about television ads or even magazine ads or, radio. But now we're talking about companies getting into video games and paying kidfluencers to go on TikTok or wherever, and, their YouTube shows and for highlight their foods. Yeah.
Is it truly just or mostly racial oppression that there aren't grocery stores? I mean, even just, a Ralph's or an Albertsons doesn't have to be a Whole Foods. Like, why aren't there good grocery stores in these neighborhoods that you're speaking of? And it's just fast food and liquor stores and corner stores. Why is that laid out like that?
Well, a lot of it is just economics as well, because a lot of these neighborhoods, because of systemic racism and oppression, right, that has gone throughout history, means that a lot of Black communities, Latino communities are poor. And so it's hard to run a store in a poor area because the people don't have as much money. Your store doesn't make as much money, right? And so when you look at cities and the way that they've developed, you also see this pattern of white flight, right? So places that used to be thriving urban centers, and then as the sort of demographics change and white people decided to move out to suburbs, then the grocery stores followed them. And in some cases, they also blocked other stores from being able to move in. So sometimes they wouldn't give up the land or, allow them to rent, or they'd put in some kind of clause that it couldn't be converted into another company's store. So you kind of get these sad stories, but a lot of it is just kind of about property law and zoning and that, but really comes down to what people can afford. And then ironically, poor people end up paying more for groceries because they can't go to places like Costco and buy things in bulk. Right? And the stores that are catering to poor neighborhoods have to charge more for each item because otherwise it's not sustainable for them as an economic model.
Just to clarify, is that the Walmart way of business when you say they close down and move somewhere else and they don't want anyone else to be in that space so that the people will have to drive out, or take a bus to their new location? That way they have a busier location in one place instead of two locations, that it basically serving the same population.
That does not surprise me about Walmart, but it's not something that I had known before.
Oh, okay. Yeah. There's a documentary on it about Walmart's, what they do. So I'm just wondering what would be in the interest of the grocery store to close down and then hurt the community by saying, oh, but no other food place can be here. I couldn't make it here, but I'm not going to let anyone else be here either.
Yeah, I know. It does seem, I mean, what you said does make sense that whoever could would then follow them somewhere else. But yeah, it does seem kind of just vindictive or not even making real economic sense.
What if I told you that you could feed your dog food that's not only healthier, but also better for the planet? Introducing Earth Animal Wisdom from the Seed Recipe dog food, crafted with care to be healthy for your pet and gentle on the environment. And this complete and balanced formula is carefully air dried at the optimal temperature to preserve vital nutrients your dog needs to thrive, regardless of their age or size, with pure plant nutrition. This is honestly the best vegan dried dog food we have ever tried. It's so easy to purchase too. You're just going to go to earthanimal.com/switch for good. And then also just simply place switch for good in the discount code box at checkout for 20% off your order. So go run, buy your Earth Animal. All right, now back to our conversation. And thinking about, other places than the U.S. and the various world economies. And I'm wondering, I know you've studied food inequality in the UK, and I'm curious how it compares to the food equality in the U.S. And then if there's lessons that can be learned, possibly to apply to both contexts, but maybe lessons from the UK that can be applied here. It doesn't seem like they have the same situation, the same setup that we do. But I don't know. I've just been there. And of course, I'm probably not going to all the places that I should see. And,
Yeah. And that research is still in very preliminary stages. So, out for future works on it. But there is definitely a very similar problem over there as far as the health disparities. And so, white British people just fare better on all of those same measurements of any food related diseases than what they call BAME over there is Black, Asian, and other minority ethnicities. And
who have migrated there.
Yeah.
For the most part. Okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, there have been Black people, Asian people, which there means Indian usually, right?
Yeah, right, Asian. Right.
They've been there for a really long time. And this is all because of the colonial history of the UK. So we have a very similar disparity there. And then we have different kinds of racial history and oppression, but very much alive. So, it just, I can't say confidently at this point that they're doing it any better or that we have anything to learn. There's a lot of issues over there as well. Yeah. And a lot of the same blaming of people for their health issues that result from structural choices made intentionally by the government that do not reflect people's taste or choice or anything like that. And so that is, we definitely have in common.
like blaming a race for being less healthy or heavier and things like that.
Yeah, like saying, oh, Black people just love Southern food and they just can't help themselves, and that's why they're not healthy. It's not, it's not because, of all these systemic issues that are in the book and that we're touching on now.
Just to go back briefly to the marketing thing, you have talked about how we can counteract this strong effect of marketing on kids. Can you talk about that?
Mhm. Yeah, so it's interesting when you look at these studies of kids, and there's been a lot of push towards, instead of making corporations change, instead of making schools change, fast food, anything, oh, let's try to change kids' behavior, right? And so a lot of money was poured into things like, oh, if you cut up carrots instead of offering them whole, then kids will eat carrots. Or if you give them a cute, funny name, right? That kind of thing. And then another thing that is always favored over by corporations than regulation is education. And so the kind of education that usually is promoted is health education. But that is not very effective. What is more effective is teaching kids that corporations are manipulating them and sort of steering their choices and just exploiting and trying to make money from them. And so some of these campaigns have really changed kids' behavior. And so I think that's interesting. And I think it really goes to all of us that none of us want to think that our choices are not our own and people are just making money off of us. And, usually kids are smarter than grown-ups anyway, in my experience. Uh, so, and then, the real changes have to come from on high, like we need to change what is offered in the public school system as far as food, what is allowed into public schools, right? What neighborhoods look like, and all those are the things that would really make a difference. As far as marketing, we could put restrictions on, where corporations are allowed to be. Are they really allowed to put vending machines into video games? Like, that doesn't seem great. These kind of like Spanish language game apps that McDonald's has, like they just have infiltrated kid culture in so many ways. And it would be quite easy to say, you just can't do that. And it would be justified very easily through medical statistics and data, because there is a strong correlation between marketing and health. And that is why the corporations are holding on to it so dearly.
Just a question about the video games. Sorry, Dacia. I want to let you ask your question, but I don't play video games. So is the marketing done where there's a vending machine and a kid in the can buy something from that vending machine in the game, or is it just in the background as advertising like we see billboards?
Yeah, they have actually games with active vending, so that then that's information to profile the player, right? So if you,
what's active vending? Like it doesn't shoot
like
out of the game.
Your avatar will go and select something out of the machine. They also had one where you could actually order pizza while you're playing, and the pizza will come to your house.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Oh, a real pizza.
A real one.
Actual
wow.
pizza. Yeah. So they've really gotten themselves in.
Jeez.
It's not just like passive product placement.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's actually integrated into play.
Yeah. It's so embedded. I want to just talk a little bit, get your thoughts on milk and its link to white supremacy. It seems to me that, the kind of the Aryan nation, if you will, right? People say, oh, we're drink the most milk and we're the strongest and we're the tallest and we're the most mentally acute, which is all completely untrue. There's only one blue zone in the United States, and it's down the street at Loma Linda, where they eat a mostly plant-based diet. But that's the connection, it seems to me, that they're making when they're guzzling, gallons of milk while wearing diapers. Still don't understand the diaper part. But what is this connection? It's at least 100 years old, of milk and white supremacy. And I guess how did it really get started?
It started with the earliest known milk booster, and his name was E.V. McCollum. And he was like a nutritional scientist before that was really a thing, right? And still people have their doubts about how much of a science that is. But he pioneered some kind of experimentation methods with animals for nutrition. And so he gained prominence in that way. And he just decided that milk, along with greens, were super protective foods that everyone should eat. So what became interesting is that the whole greens thing just dropped away because whereas the dairy industry really, seized on him and appreciated him, and Hoover, especially at that time, he was running the Food Administration, and he sent E.V. McCollum around the country to make speeches about nutrition and milk. And he's the one who started saying, the Aryans drink milk, which is true. Those are kind of like the sort of Northern European, Scandinavian people who have the greatest ability to digest milk. And they're such, wonderful paragons of humanity. Therefore, milk equals good, right? But there was a great need at that time to try to make milk look good, because milk was responsible for a lot of, initially infant deaths, a lot of transmission of diseases like tuberculosis, hand, foot, and mouth disease, other things. So milk had a really bad name. And instead of just abandoning it, they just upped these efforts of trying to convince people that it was essential part of the diet. So he started that association, and it's been with us ever since.
And what about the alt-right folks? Richard Spencer posted on Twitter that he is very very lactose tolerant, like it was linked with his manliness, or like Jotzi was saying, fitness. How are they using milk to highlight differences between white people and other people?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the same idea. It's okay, we've got that kind of white Aryan vibe, and then we're the strongest, and milk being literally white has something to do with it, right? Although that white color is not the natural color of milk, right? It goes through processes a lot of the time to become what we think of as that pure white. So it's just that idea of purity. It's, on these alt-right websites, you can see the maps of people around the world. So it's just this kind of really strange association of whiteness and purity and superiority that just doesn't seem to quit.
Dusty, what was the diaper thing? I never seen that.
Well, I know there's one because I saw it. There could be multiple videos on YouTube when you kind of look up white supremacy and milk and just go down that lovely rabbit hole. There's a video of like, I don't know, just 10 or 12 guys hanging out at a party, guzzling milk, and they have diapers on and nothing else. I don't know.
I think it's because the idea is that you wouldn't have to stop to go to the bathroom.
Oh, dear God. Yeah.
That's
ton of sense.
Another kind of fetish thing where
it looks super fetishy. Okay.
And then that's just so that they can consume uninterrupted.
Oh my God.
So if you just want to guzzle milk all night and you don't want to have to stop to go to the bathroom, you have a diaper, it's perfect.
Wow. Wow. There was the one of my favorite movies, my favorite movie of that year, whichever year it was, I guess maybe 2017, was called Get Out, which was directed by an African-American filmmaker and had mostly a Black cast. And it had was a metaphor for racism. And apparently there was one of the white racists in the movie just slowly drinking milk. I had no idea that milk was associated with white supremacy until researching you, Andrea.
From Jordan Peele's masterpiece, that is not just a metaphor for racism, but a very explicit take on how this group of white people are, kind of slave traders, and how he gets involved. But one of them, she's not just drinking the milk; she's separating her Fruit Loops. So the idea is that she doesn't want to sully the whiteness and the purity of the milk by having what is traditionally done. You pour your milk in your cereal and you eat it, but then, with these things we used to have as kids, and they probably still do today, I don't know, it turns your milk different colors.
Oh, and God forbid that, because the rainbow means homosexuality, and that would be terrible. Oh, that's so interesting. I had forgotten that. I had just read it probably in one of your writings about the movie, so I'd forgotten that. Yeah. Great movie, everybody. I highly recommend.
Absolutely. Sometimes on planes, I just put it on in the background and watch it like 10 times.
Right.
The long haul flights.
Exactly. If I were, it's so deeply embedded in us, I think, as white people, to not even really be able to see that there is food oppression and that there is a problem. And only in doing this work and just diving deeper and deeper and deeper, do I come popping out with, I'm not in for Thanksgiving anymore, you guys, mom and dad, like family. It's not happening.
On many levels.
So on all the levels, right? Obviously, yeah, right. From veganism into what we're talking about today. So if I were to more eloquently express and explain to my family, how is food oppression set up or created so that people don't even realize that there's a problem? Because that's where, my family and I used to live in this. There's no problem. What's the problem? How would I explain it to them in a way that, that would make some sense, at least, what food oppression, well, not what it is, I think they know what it is, but how it's set up so that they are clouded from the truth.
Yeah. So I think it's always compelling to start with statistics and to show, we talked a little about in the beginning about how poor nutrition is responsible for, all these deaths now, but we didn't talk about the fact that there's a racial divide in that. And in every single one of the food related illnesses and conditions that end up killing people, white people have it less, right? So depending on which it is, Indigenous people may have the highest rates of type 2 diabetes, right? Black people have more heart disease, strokes, all of these things. And so first you just lay that out and say, okay, there has to be a reason for this, right? And the reason is not this myth of personal choice when it comes to food, right? Because of so many of the things we've been talking about, that if you're at a certain economic status, which most people are, right? Most people in this country are not rich, and they are not just buying whatever they want all the time, right? Then you have your access to food is very restricted. So we love to talk about, it's so important for us to have our own choice, and the government, we don't want this nanny state. We don't want the government to tell us you can eat that and you can't eat that, even if that thing is like a chemical banned all over the world that will destroy your stomach lining. Well, we don't care. We want to make our own choices, right? This is the kind of American ideal. So we have to combat that idea that actually people are making choices, because they're not. They're completely constrained by what they're being given, maybe through a government program like a public school or WIC or SNAP, or if you live on a reservation, or if you have to access, emergency food and food banks. You're not making any choices, right? And then other choices are framed by where you live and what's in your neighborhood. So the actual amount of choice that anyone can make of what they eat is extremely small. And the less money, and time and other resources that you have, the more it shrinks. So if the whole system is set up to give more people access and choice and time and freedom and money, and other people don't have it, that oppression is not visible because we come out saying the opposite. We're saying things like, yeah, we're feeding kids in school. That's great. People should just be grateful, right? Instead of saying, okay, we're feeding them, but the food we're giving them is making them sick and leading to early deaths. Are we really doing anyone a favor? Right. So it's that framing and trying to explain how things that sound like taste and choice actually aren't. They're completely structured by our laws and our
Yeah,
policy.
to be the antithesis.
Does that help?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Watch out, mom and dad.
There we go.
They're great. They're
You can blame me or just tell them to call me. I don't know.
Let's talk about the school lunch program. We haven't really gotten into it. Dotsy's
Yeah.
talked a lot about it. We have had guests on. Switch for Good focuses a lot on trying to improve, especially where when it comes to giving kids, like she said, choice to have something other than milk as a beverage. But tell us more about how the school lunch program is affecting kids in schools.
Yeah, I mean, it affects them a lot because what kids get to eat at school affects everything about their days and their lives. So we, in many places now, are able to offer kids breakfast and lunch and even sometimes extra food that they might eat at home later. And for some kids, that's the bulk of or the only food that they end up consuming every day because of circumstances out of their control in their homes. But the food is not the kind of food that gives you energy and wakes you up and helps your brain work, right? It's the kind that drains your energy. It makes you feel sluggish, and there's an effect on ability to take in information. And so that affects education and that affects employment opportunities and basically the entire rest of your life. So we have the government and the USDA looking at schools as one, a dumping ground for surplus commodities. And that is completely indifferent to the needs of kids who have to stay awake and study and participate in activities and have energy from good food, right? And also allowing the schools to host food corporations, that are selling equally bad food as is being given out in the cafeteria. So even there, when it looks like you have a choice, none of the choices are really good.
Right. It's harder to get a broccoli company to go in there. It's much easier to get a processed food company to go in there. What kind of
the money.
commodities? Right. What kind of commodities are you talking about when you say they're the ones that are pushed? I've been out of school for 40 years, and so I don't have children. I don't really know what a school lunch looks like. Can you share with us a little bit about that? And does it differ in terms of the economic strength of that district?
Yeah, I have some really shocking pictures of school lunches that I could potentially share with you also, but what happens is a lot of these foods that even don't sound that bad, like corn. Oh, corn sounds good, right? But by the time it gets to a school, it's not fresh corn on the cob, it's corn syrup, right? And so you get a lot of foods that are just full of corn syrup. Soybeans, again, oh, delicious. Edamame are we having? That sounds great. No, we're having oil. So they get converted into oil, right? So then your meats and your milks, and what you end up with is the tater tots, the chicken nuggets, the hot dogs, just like, a lot of pizza, right? French fries, all the junk foods that society says are what kids want to eat, is what is being served to them. And even when we've seen some change, where some administrations, like with the Obamas, have changed some of the rules, there's so much backlash. And then it's put on the kids they'll say, oh, kids just don't want to eat that. It's too much waste. They throw it away. Right. And
therein lies such a big problem.
yeah, this kind of myth that, again, so it's not even just, by race, it's also by age, oh, kids, they don't want this. Well, I don't know. They will.
It's like we've poisoned them to such a degree and have them so addicted to salt, fat, and processed sugar that if you put steamed broccoli on their plate, they're right. They're not going to touch it. I mean, I don't know how we back out of that.
Yeah, I mean, eventually they will. It's just, it takes time to.
If that was all that was on there, they're not going to starve.
Yeah, I mean, our whole society doesn't help, because you go to a restaurant and you would think kid food would actually be the healthiest food on the menu, because kids are the ones that need the most. They're growing. They need the vitamins and the minerals. It says the crappiest food you can imagine. Like, it's completely counterintuitive, doesn't make any sense.
And is it different in different schools depending upon how wealthy the school district is?
If you're really rich as a district, then you could afford to say no to federal funding, because that's what happens. If you use the federal food program and the commodities, you're saving money by virtue of the fact that some of the commodities are free or very low priced, but also because you're then getting some federal reimbursement for your school meals. If you decide not to operate under the federal rules and take their commodities, then you got to pay for everything yourself. So if you live in a district where you can do that, then there's a potential, like Berkeley, and some kind of upstate New York schools, then yes, you could be lucky enough. But generally, most schools need money. It's hard to think of a public school that really can just afford to say, we're fine, keep your federal money.
Up in Sherman Oaks, where the wonderful Marielle Williamson, who we've had on the podcast, ended up suing her school because the principal, she wanted to do some tabling on plant-based milk so kids could just taste all the varieties and see what they like. And because it's a federal law, he said, no, you can do it, but you have to include a dairy table too. And she was like, no, that defeats the entire purpose anyway. So she did win the lawsuit. But at her school, she said that, and it's, I think, a pretty well-off school, they did stock soy milk and almond milk in the back, not paid for by the government, because the kids really wanted it. And she said, but there's not nearly enough because they had to pay for it. And she said, so we'd kind of rush to the counter to ask for the soy milk, and they had to go in the back and get it because they couldn't display it alongside the dairy. And she said, sometimes there'd just be, 5 or 6 containers, and then that was it. So that just shows, for some kids and at some schools, it is desired. They're dying for something different, or they've tasted at home. They like how it tastes. I mean, we're almost at 47% of households are stocking some kind of plant-based milk. Now, they might also be stocking some dairy milk, but kids are, they're wanting an alternative. They're desiring an alternative, and they like it better. So,
the schools make it very difficult.
Yeah.
You're not even supposed to give a kid an alternative milk unless they have a diagnosis.
Yeah, and a note, right?
Yeah.
That's part of what our bill reverses, because another way to oppress poorer children, because first of all, many of the parents, I mean, I didn't even know what lactose intolerant was until I dove into this. So most of the parents may not realize that their child is lactose intolerant, or that's the problem, or even what lactose is. And then they can't take them to a doctor. Maybe they don't have access to a doctor or could afford a doctor. So another way to oppress, you need these notes from these people that maybe the kid doesn't have access to bring to the school to say that you need an alternative milk from cow's milk.
Work because doctors don't work at night or on the weekends.
Right. They can't even get, so many layers of,
Yeah. Also, one thing, one story I like to tell in starting my first book is the way that the doctor's offices have these, when my kids were born and they hand out these pamphlets and tell you, here's what you feed your kids when they're this age and that age. And it's like, I looked at it and I said, oh, this was produced by the National Dairy Council. And so I went to my pediatrician and I said, did you know that this is just like a propaganda thing that they gave you? Like it says, right. He said, I had no idea.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
He didn't even know.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And said, read the tiny, tiny, tiny print on the bottom and the back. Yeah. It's right. Yeah.
Before we go, just touch on your book, Skimmed. Dotsie mentioned it in the intro, and in the 70s, and Dotsie knows this, and some of our audience does because I've talked about it. My mom had us all boycott Nestle because of what they were doing in African countries by insisting that formula be sold. Or well, first they gave it to mothers in Africa, and their breast milk dried up, but because a lot of the women either were illiterate, so couldn't read the directions on how to add water, how much water to add to the formula, or the water was dirty, or after their breast dried up, they now couldn't afford the formula, so they would dilute it and the babies would become malnourished. Just a way to undermine the natural breastfeeding that especially, that people that we should all have, but that poorer people rely on. Tell us a little bit about Skimmed so that if people are interested, they can read that, or certainly your most recent book, Ruin Their Crops on the Ground.
Skim focuses on the story of these girls who were the first recorded Black identical quadruplets that survived. And a formula company, there was an auction and they bid for the rights to use them in their promotional materials. It was the first time that a major corporation had used Black models except to sell anything except for cigarettes, alcohol, or beauty products.
And this was the 50s or early.
Yeah. They were born in 1946. So they became these poster girls for formula. They're absolutely beautiful and adorable. At the same time, they were separated from their families. They were exploited, so this company, Pet Milk, which is still around, made millions off of them while they lived in poverty for their entire lives. But it opened the door to this new kind of targeted, race targeted marketing of formula and other products that contributed to the fact that we still have today that Black families are breastfeed much less than other families. And that's completely fine if it's a choice, but it's really not a choice. So that book is about first food oppression and the way that law and policy has structured society so that many families don't have a choice as to what they feed their infants. And a lot of the products that are formula are similar to some of the things we're talking about today, as far as the school lunches, like the kind of junk full of a lot of these subsidized commodities, like milk, like corn syrup, soy, other things.
I have one last question. We're going to let you go. This whole interview, I've been wondering, is there a story behind you knowing and realizing and knowing that you want this to be your life's work?
It's been an evolution of my sort of early interests in anti-racist work, which is, ever since I was a young teenager, forming a coalition at the University of Toronto in my strong protest days.
In your DNA a little bit.
Yeah. And then I just really care about food. And I think that it's an aspect of racial justice that's often overlooked. I mean, there's tons of people doing amazing work on it, especially, within, grassroots work and community work and that. But as far as like legal academic work, it's not very common. And so it seemed to me like a perfect fit for me to work on this. And I'm fascinated by food and I'm really committed to racial justice. So it just all kind of came together.
Yeah.
Wow. Well,
Wow,
thanks so much.
you're very inspiring to talk to just understand the history so that we can help to fix the future. Hopefully you'll allow me to contact you a few more times as we traverse
Sure.
what we're doing with the bill. But yeah, this has been illuminating. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you.